If you think you know how custody battles end, think again. What I'm about to tell you will shock you to your core. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because this story has twists you won't see coming. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a 34-year-old mother of 2 beautiful children living in suburban Denver, Colorado. 3 years ago, I thought I had the perfect marriage. I was wrong in ways I never could have imagined. What started as a typical divorce turned into the fight of my life, one where my ex-husband David tried to manipulate the system to take my children away from me. But he had no idea what I had been preparing for. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. David and I met in college at the University of Colorado. He was charming, ambitious, and seemed like the perfect father material. We married young, had our daughter Emma when I was 27, and our son Jake 2 years later. For 8 years, I believed we were building something beautiful together. David worked as a financial advisor while I managed our home and worked part-time as a freelance graphic designer from our house in Lakewood. The cracks started showing slowly. David became increasingly controlling about money, demanding to see every receipt, questioning every purchase I made for the kids or household. He'd come home from work in these dark moods, snapping at Emma and Jake for normal childhood behavior. When I tried to address his anger, he'd flip it around, making me feel like I was the problem. "You're too sensitive, Sarah," he'd say, that condescending tone creeping into his voice. "You're turning the kids into weaklings." But it was the night of Emma's 10th birthday party that everything changed forever. We'd invited about 15 kids from her class to our backyard. I'd spent weeks planning, decorating our deck with purple streamers, Emma's favorite color, and organizing games. The kids were having a blast on the swing set David had installed the previous summer. That's when I heard shouting. David was yelling at Jake, who was only 8, because he'd accidentally knocked over a bowl of chips while playing tag with his friends. But this wasn't normal parent frustration. David grabbed Jake's arm so hard that my son cried out in pain. "You're embarrassing me in front of everyone," David hissed, his grip tightening. I rushed over, my heart pounding. "David, let go of him. He's just a kid." The look David gave me was pure ice. "Stay out of this, Sarah. Someone needs to teach him consequences." That's when I noticed the other parents staring. Mrs. Henderson from down the street had this horrified expression, and I realized this wasn't the first time people had witnessed David's temper. The party continued, but the damage was done. Jake spent the rest of the evening clinging to my side, and Emma kept asking why Daddy was so angry. That night, after the kids were asleep, I confronted David in our kitchen. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across his face as he sat at our oak dining table, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. "We need to talk about what happened today," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. David didn't even look up. "Jake needs discipline. You coddle him too much." "Grabbing him like that wasn't discipline, David. You hurt him. I saw the mark on his arm." That's when he finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. "You're questioning my parenting? You, who lets them run wild all day while you play on your computer?" The argument escalated quickly. David started listing everything he thought was wrong with how I raised our children, how I was too lenient, how I was ruining them. But it was what he said next that made me realize I was looking at a stranger. "Maybe they'd be better off without your influence entirely." Those words echoed in my head for weeks. I started paying closer attention to David's interactions with Emma and Jake. I noticed how they'd tense up when his car pulled into the driveway, how Emma had stopped showing him her artwork from school, how Jake had developed a stutter that only appeared when his father was around. I began documenting everything, not because I was planning to leave, not yet, but because something inside me said I needed to protect my children. I started taking photos of any marks or bruises, though David was careful to avoid visible areas. I kept a journal of his outbursts, noting dates, times, and witnesses when possible. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in October. David had been drinking, something that was becoming more frequent, and Jake had spilled juice on some financial documents David had left on the coffee table. The explosion that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. David didn't just yell. He picked up Jake, who was sobbing and apologizing, and shook him so hard I thought my son's neck might snap. Emma started screaming from the stairway where she'd been watching, and I knew in that moment that I had to get my children out of this house. "Stop! You're going to hurt him!" I shouted, grabbing David's arm. He turned on me with such fury that I stumbled backward. "You want to see hurt, Sarah? Keep pushing me." That night, after David passed out on the couch, I held both my children in my bed while they cried themselves to sleep. Jake's little body was shaking, and Emma kept whispering, "Why is Daddy so mean to us?" I made the call to a divorce attorney the next morning. What I didn't expect was how vicious David would become once he realized he was losing control. The man I'd married disappeared completely, replaced by someone who would stop at nothing to maintain power over our family. The divorce proceedings started in November. I'd found an excellent attorney, Rebecca Chen, who specialized in high-conflict custody cases. She took one look at my documentation and photos and told me we had a strong case for primary custody with supervised visitation for David. But David had other plans. He hired Marcus Webb, one of Denver's most ruthless divorce attorneys, the kind who specialized in destroying mothers in custody battles. Suddenly, I wasn't just fighting for my children. I was fighting for my reputation, my sanity, and my future. David's strategy became clear quickly. He was going to paint me as an unfit mother while positioning himself as the stable, financially secure parent who could provide better for Emma and Jake. The man who had terrorized his own children was now claiming he was their protector. The lies started immediately. David filed papers claiming I had anger management issues, that I was emotionally unstable, and that I was alienating the children against him. He provided evidence in the form of text messages taken completely out of context and testimony from his brother, who claimed he'd witnessed me yelling at the kids during family gatherings. But the most devastating blow came when David accused me of having a drinking problem. I sat in Rebecca's office, staring at the legal documents that painted me as an alcoholic who put my children in danger. The evidence was a collection of photos David had taken of me having wine with dinner or at social events. Normal adult behavior twisted into something sinister. "He's building a narrative," Rebecca explained, her voice gentle but serious. "This is classic abuser behavior during divorce. They project their own issues onto their victims." The irony wasn't lost on me. David, who had been drinking increasingly heavily, was accusing me of the very problem he was developing. But in a custody battle, perception often matters more than truth. The court ordered a custody evaluation, which meant months of interviews, psychological testing, and home visits. Dr. Patricia Morse, a court-appointed psychologist, would ultimately recommend how custody should be divided. This is where David's manipulation reached new heights. He transformed himself for the evaluation process. The angry, controlling man I knew was replaced by a charming, concerned father who spoke eloquently about his love for his children and his concerns about their mother's stability. He'd cleaned up his drinking, at least temporarily, and presented himself as the reliable parent with steady income and a stable home environment. Meanwhile, I was struggling to hold everything together. The stress of the divorce, combined with being a single mother, had taken its toll. I'd lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and yes, I'd had a few emotional breakdowns in Dr. Morse's office when discussing David's abuse. In David's narrative, these were signs of instability. In reality, they were the normal reactions of a trauma victim trying to protect her children. The home visits were particularly cruel. David had moved into a pristine 2-bedroom apartment in a nice part of town, complete with separate bedrooms for Emma and Jake, new furniture, and a refrigerator stocked with healthy food. When Dr. Morse visited, David played the perfect father, helping with homework and preparing nutritious meals. My home visits were more complicated. I was still living in our family house, but with David's income gone, I was struggling financially. The kids' rooms were the same, but the house showed signs of stress. Dishes in the sink, laundry that needed folding, the general chaos of a mother juggling everything alone. Dr. Morse's questions felt like attacks. "Mrs. Mitchell, Emma mentioned that you sometimes cry at night. Can you explain that? Jake seems anxious during our sessions. How do you address his emotional needs? Your neighbors mentioned raised voices from your home. Can you elaborate?" Every normal human emotion, every sign of the stress I was under was cataloged as potential evidence against my fitness as a mother. But the worst was yet to come. 3 months into the evaluation process, David dropped his bombshell. He filed for emergency temporary custody, claiming I had been drinking and driving with the children in the car. The evidence was a photo David had somehow obtained of me leaving a restaurant where I'd had dinner with Emma and Jake on a Sunday afternoon. He claimed I'd been drinking and endangered our children by driving them home. The truth? I'd had 1 glass of wine with my meal, something any adult has the right to do, and was completely sober when we left. But David had been following us, waiting for any opportunity to make me look bad. The emergency hearing was a nightmare. David's attorney presented this photo along with his claims, and suddenly I found myself defending my right to have a normal dinner with my children. The judge granted David temporary custody pending further investigation. I'll never forget the looks on Emma and Jake's faces when I had to tell them they'd be staying with their father for the next few weeks. Emma, now 11, looked at me with such confusion and fear. "Did we do something wrong, Mommy?" Jake, who had just turned 9, burst into tears. "I don't want to stay with Daddy. He gets scary." But the court order was clear. I could only see my children during supervised visits twice a week for 3 hours at a time in a sterile family services office with a social worker watching our every interaction. David had won the first round, and he knew it. During those supervised visits, Emma and Jake would tell me about life at their father's apartment, how he'd become the perfect dad in public, but still had his angry moments when no one was watching, how he'd quiz them about our conversations and get upset if they seemed too happy to see me. "He tells us you're sick, Mommy," Emma whispered during one visit, glancing nervously at the social worker. "He says that's why we can't live with you right now." My heart shattered into pieces, but I had to stay strong for them. "I'm not sick, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, and the court has to decide what's best. But I love you both more than anything in the world, and I'm fighting to bring you home." That's when Jake, wise beyond his 9 years, said something that changed everything. "Mommy, I wrote down all the times Daddy gets mad at us when nobody's watching." Emma helped me spell the big words. It turns out my children had been keeping their own record. Over the next 2 weeks, during our supervised visits, Emma and Jake carefully told me about David's behavior when they were alone with him. How he'd scream at them for minor mistakes, how he'd threaten to make sure they never lived with me again if they said anything bad about him, how he'd throw things when he thought they were asleep. But here's what David didn't know. I had been preparing my own surprise for months. Remember how I mentioned I'd been documenting everything from early in our marriage? That documentation hadn't stopped during our divorce. With Rebecca's guidance, I'd been building a comprehensive case that went far beyond my word against David's. First, I'd hired a private investigator, James Morrison, a former police detective who specialized in domestic cases. While David was busy playing the perfect father in court, James was documenting David's real behavior. Photos of David drinking heavily at bars on nights he had the kids. Videos of him screaming at them in parking lots when he thought no one could see. Testimonies from neighbors who'd witnessed his outbursts. Second, I'd been working with Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. She'd been meeting with Emma and Jake during my supervised visits, helping them process their experiences and, with court approval, documenting the signs of emotional abuse they displayed. Third, and this was the big one, I'd discovered David's financial fraud. Remember how controlling David had been about money during our marriage? How he'd demand to see every receipt but never let me see the full picture of our finances? It turns out he'd been hiding assets and income for years, including unreported cash payments from clients and a secret investment account he'd never disclosed to the court. My attorney Rebecca had hired a forensic accountant, Maria Santos, who'd spent months unraveling David's financial deception. The man who was claiming he deserved custody because of his financial stability had been committing tax fraud and hiding money from his own family. But I saved the best evidence for last. David had made one crucial mistake during this entire process. He'd underestimated his own children. Emma and Jake, despite being young, had smartphones that David had given them to stay in contact during the custody battle. What David didn't realize was that both children had been using voice memo apps to record his angry outbursts when they were alone with him. Over 3 months of temporary custody, they'd collected over 40 recordings of David screaming at them, threatening them, and saying things about me that no father should ever say to his children about their mother. These weren't ambiguous moments that could be interpreted different ways. These were clear, undeniable evidence of emotional abuse. The recordings were heartbreaking to listen to. David calling Emma stupid for forgetting her homework. David telling Jake he was weak like his mother for crying. David threatening to make sure they never saw me again if they didn't stop being difficult. But the most damning recording was David talking on the phone to his brother, not realizing Jake's phone was recording nearby. In it, David laughed about how easy it had been to manipulate the court system and bragged about how he was going to destroy Sarah completely so he could have full control over the kids and avoid paying child support. "The stupid court believes everything I tell them," David's voice came through clearly on the recording. "Sarah's so emotional and scattered right now, she's making my job easy. By the time I'm done, she'll be lucky to see them once a month." That recording alone was enough to change everything, but I had one more surprise waiting. The final custody hearing was scheduled for a cold February morning. I walked into that Denver courthouse knowing I had evidence that would not only win me custody, but potentially result in criminal charges against David for perjury and financial fraud. David sat at his attorney's table looking confident and polished. He'd maintained his act perfectly for months and clearly believed he'd won. Marcus Webb, his attorney, had that smug expression of someone who thought they held all the winning cards. When Judge Patricia Williams called the session to order, Rebecca stood up and said words that I'll never forget. "Your Honor, we have new evidence that fundamentally changes this case." The look of confusion on David's face was almost satisfying. Almost. Over the next 4 hours, Rebecca systematically presented everything we'd gathered. The private investigator's evidence showing David's real behavior. The forensic accountant's findings about his hidden assets and tax fraud. Dr. Rodriguez's evaluation showing clear signs of emotional trauma in both children, consistent with psychological abuse. But when Rebecca played the first recording of David screaming at Jake, you could hear a pin drop in that courtroom. David's face went white as his own voice filled the room, calling his 9-year-old son pathetic for being afraid during a thunderstorm. Judge Williams stopped the recording and looked directly at David. "Mr. Mitchell, is that your voice we just heard?" David's attorney was frantically whispering in his ear, but David seemed to be in shock. There must be some explanation." Rebecca played recording after recording, each one worse than the last. David's threats, his cruel words, his manipulative behavior, all captured in his own voice, undeniably real. The recording of David's phone conversation with his brother was the final nail in the coffin. As his laughter about manipulating the court system played for everyone to hear, I watched David's carefully constructed facade crumble completely. Judge Williams called a recess, and when we returned, her decision was swift and decisive. Not only did I receive full custody of Emma and Jake, but David's visitation was suspended entirely pending completion of an anger management program and supervised psychological evaluation. The court also ordered an investigation into David's perjury and financial fraud, which would later result in criminal charges. But the most important moment came when I was finally able to take my children home. Emma and Jake ran into my arms outside the courthouse, and for the first time in months, I saw genuine joy on their faces. "We're really coming home, Mommy?" Jake asked, still not quite believing it was over. "Yes, baby. We're going home, and no one can take you away from me again." The drive back to our house in Lakewood was quiet, except for the kids' excited chatter about being home. As we pulled into our driveway, Emma said something that made me realize how much they'd grown through this ordeal. "Mommy, we knew you were fighting for us. That's why we helped." These children, who had endured so much, had found the courage to stand up for themselves and help save our family. That evening, as I tucked them into their own beds for the first time in months, I reflected on everything we'd been through. David had tried to use the system against me, believing that his manipulation and lies would be enough to take my children away. He'd underestimated not just me, but Emma and Jake's resilience and intelligence. The aftermath was extensive. David faced criminal charges for perjury and tax evasion. The IRS launched their own investigation into his hidden income. His financial planning business suffered as word spread about his legal troubles. The man who had tried to destroy our family ended up destroying his own life instead. More importantly, Emma and Jake began healing. We all started therapy with Dr. Rodriguez, learning to process the trauma we'd experienced and rebuild our sense of security. It took time, but gradually, the anxious, fearful children who had lived under David's control began to blossom into confident, happy kids again. Jake's stutter disappeared within weeks of coming home. Emma started showing me her artwork again, including a drawing she made titled, "Our Family is Safe Now," that still hangs on our refrigerator. Today, 3 years later, we're thriving. I've expanded my graphic design business and no longer live in fear of someone trying to control or manipulate us. Emma is now 14 and wants to be a lawyer. She says she wants to help other kids like we were helped. Jake is 12 and has developed a passion for recording technology, inspired by how his recordings helped save our family. David has had no contact with us since the court case ended. He completed his anger management program but never requested visitation. Sometimes I wonder if losing so completely made him realize the damage he'd caused, or if he simply moved on to try to control someone else's life. What I learned through this nightmare is that abusers count on their victims being too afraid, too overwhelmed, or too broken to fight back effectively. David's biggest mistake was underestimating my love for my children and their love for me. He thought he could manipulate the system because he'd manipulated our family for so long. But he never counted on facing a mother who had been quietly preparing for battle, children brave enough to document their own abuse, and a legal system that, when presented with real evidence, still knows how to protect families. The surprise I had waiting for David wasn't just the evidence we'd gathered. It was the strength and unity of a family that refused to be destroyed. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that show the power of perseverance and truth. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that even in the darkest times, there's always hope for justice. What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Let us know in the comments below.